Okay, great. Welcome everyone. This is meeting number 6, our last set of meetings. We have part 1 today and part 1 tomorrow. If there are folks that are in the Zoom meeting that are not members of the TCWG or staff or invited guests, we ask that you watch this meeting using the live stream. The live stream address is www.rossstrategic.com/livestream. If anyone's having any technical difficulties, you can email Michaela at munda@rossstrategic.com. Kathleen, I want to turn it over to you to kick us off.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first of our last 2 meetings on the Transmission Corridor Work Group. I can't tell you how happy I am with the participation and efforts of everyone in this work group over the past 9 months. I wish we could be in person. I think I'd probably recognize you more by voice than necessarily by your image if we were to meet in person, but I hope we have that opportunity in the future. We have a couple of presentations today, bringing us to that next level of really where we go from here, as well as finalizing our recommendations, our principles, and all the work we've been working on throughout the year. So thank you all for being here again, and I look forward to our discussions. Rob. Great.
Thank you, Kathleen. Okay, so this is how, Michaela, if you could advance the slides for me, please. This is how we're going to spend our time together. So we've got our full day today, and then we've got our 3-hour day, first half today, and then we have our second half of our meeting tomorrow. What we plan to talk about today, as Kathleen indicated, is we're going to get right to the content. As we were working to pull together the final draft of the report, which distributed a little over a week ago, there was some input that we received from folks that there was the possibility to strengthen and bolster 2 parts of the report, particularly as it pertain to the principles. The first has to do with exploring what does coordination look like regionally, and is there an opportunity to potentially think about a principle about a study. And at the same time, we heard from folks within the state family that there might be some need to do that kind of work to support the ability of accessing some of the resources available at the federal level to for the transportation infrastructure. So what we're going to do this morning is we're going to hear from 2 folks. We're going to hear from Arnie Olson, and he's going to share some information about regional planning and how it's happening in other parts of the country. And then we're going to hear from Sarah Vorpal, sorry about butchering your name there, from Commerce, about what those funding opportunities look like, so that then we can have a discussion with the group of, is there anything that we learned about in those presentations that we need to augment our existing report. Following that morning, we're then following that that conversation, that break, in the second part of the meeting, we're going to spend time diving into the existing report, highlighting the areas where folks want to talk to your colleagues about, so that then, Michaela, if you could flip to the next slide, the next day we can make any final decision and final changes that we want to make to the report. Following the conversation about final changes, we're going to spend some time as a group doing go around, looking back, and then we're going to have public comment at 10:40. And so that is a change from what we had originally talked about. So if there are members on the public that are on the live stream, the public comment period is tomorrow. And we're going to end by looking forward about what comes next. Is there an opportunity to continue the momentum that was generated through this group? What does that look like, and what do future opportunities look like? So I am very, very excited for the next 2 days. Folks have any questions about our agenda? Kathleen, anything else you want to add before we jump into the first part of our agenda?
I think we're good. Thanks, Rob.
Okay, great. Michaela, if you could advance 2 slides. So now I want to invite Arnie Olson. Arnie, I think I saw you come in. If you want to flip your video on and unmute yourself. I want to turn it over to you now. With respect to timing, I know that you've got a hard stop at around 9:35 or 9:40. And so what we're going to do is we're going to do back-to-back presentations for you, Arnie, and then Sarah, and then we'll have the major discussion. If there are any clarifications, questions for Arnie, we're going to try to grab them before I turn it over to Sarah.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Rob. I hope everyone can hear me. My name is Arnie Olson. I'm a senior partner at E3, and my hard stop is a little closer to 9:30. So
okay,
I'll
problem.
I'll try to get through the material quickly and leave time for questions. So if you can go ahead and go to the next slide. Just a little bit of background. If you're not familiar with E3, we're a San Francisco-based consultancy with offices New York, Boston, and Calgary. Long history of working on transmission issues in the West. We have a wide range of clients: public sector, private, environmental advocacy organizations. As for myself, I grew up in Wenatchee and spent 6 years at the energy office in the 90s before I moved down to San Francisco. So lots and lots of background and history in the Northwest. So next slide, please. Stu asked me to just kind of give you an overview of how transmission planning works, and particularly regional transmission planning in the Northwest, in California, and elsewhere. So this is a bit of a, maybe a bit informal. It's a bit of my own views on how this works. So hopefully you'll take that for what it's worth. It's not E3's official views or anything like that, but it's a little bit of interpretation, let's say. So when we look at the literature for deep decarbonization, we find transmission is really critical. There are 4 particular use cases that emerge from the literature. Connection of remote renewable resources is probably the most obvious one. Wind in the Great Plains, offshore wind, bringing that to load centers. There are some others, harvesting load and resource diversity across neighboring regions with differing resource and load characteristics. Reliability and grid strengthening, you might think of the ERCOT example of how much they might have benefited from having additional transmission to neighboring regions during the winter storm Uri a couple of years ago. Electrification is going to be a big theme for transmission. We're going to significantly increase the peak demand for electricity, particularly in constrained regions like the Puget Sound Basin, and we'll need to plan our transmission with that big increase in peak in mind. 2 key barriers that I'll come back to throughout the presentation to interregional transmission. First are need determination, figuring out which transmission you really need because it's expensive. And then secondly, allocating the cost of that transmission and who has the authority to do that and where that all sits. So if we go to the next slide, please. So just a quick overview of how this all works in what we call the open access transmission tariff era, which was kicked off in 1996 when FERC rules opened up transmission access to third parties. Access is governed by FERC rules and tariffs. The rules for access were designed really to protect existing rights holders from encroachment by new uses. They were designed to protect the rights of entities that have entered into the transmission connection request queue, which is based on first in time. And it really is these transmission service requests is what triggers new transmission construction almost everywhere. So it's kind of a first in time approach that, in my view, this is something that was designed by lawyers and not by transmission engineers. It was designed to protect property rights for people to use these facilities for their economic purposes. And as a result, the transmission planning process it's piecemeal, and it's not proactive and forward-looking. Now, RTOs have a little bit of ability to step outside of that because they do transmission planning potentially on a forward-looking basis across broad regions. But even there, and I'll come back to this, building ahead of need is difficult and controversial, and especially if the need is driven by policy from a subset of the states in the RTO footprint. You can imagine many of them have multiple states with lots and lots of different policy environments that they're having to navigate. So it's very, very challenging. If you go to the next slide, please. So transmission planning and development is subject to what I call a confusing mix of state and federal jurisdiction. Again, in many regions, it's governed by RTOs. They're responsible for planning transmission across their footprints. You can see from the map on the right, some of those footprints are quite large. So they have the geographic scope that's needed. they have the authority also to allocate costs. Remember, that was the second key barrier to determining regional transmission construction, is you need the ability to allocate costs. RTOs have that ability. Outside of RTOs, it's largely a state jurisdictional process. States issue need determination certificates, citing bodies such as this one, and the federal government really only regulates the rates, terms, and conditions of wholesale transmission service that one system might sell to another. So the federal role outside of these RTO regions is really quite limited. Even in the RTO regions, siting and permitting, crucially, is still done by the states. So in effect, even in the RTO regions, the states still have almost a veto power over these regional transmission projects, because they still have, the companies still have to go to the state authorities to get permits and land acquisition, et cetera, for their projects. If you go to the next slide. There are a number of regional transmission planning entities that were formed in the early 2000s and were kind of reinvigorated in the last decade. Northern Grid is the one that now encompasses the Pacific Northwest region, which was formed by the merger of Columbia Grid and the Northern Tier Transmission Group. Others are West Connect in the Southwest. CAISO really operates its own transmission planning group. So these regional entities were designed to look at the regional impacts of transmission projects that their members bring forth. So they really are still in that reactive mode. They don't do proactive, forward-looking transmission planning, and they don't have any authority to allocate costs of new transmission projects to unwilling participants. So they really, they have the right footprint. They do studies of regional projects, so they're a part of the necessary process, but they themselves don't really have the ability to determine which transmission is needed for an individual state to meet its clean energy goals. If you go to the next slide. Now, the Pacific Northwest is different from the rest of the country for lots of reasons, most of them having to do with the role of the federal government, in particular BPA. So in the Northwest, most of the high voltage transmission is owned and operated by BPA. Many of the other utilities also have some of their own high voltage transmission. Most of that is in or near their load areas. Many of them rely on Bonneville for long distance transmission service. So they'll take point-to-point service from Bonneville to bring resources from remote locations to their load area. So Bonneville has some of the functions of a regional transmission planning entity, or even a regional transmission operator for the Northwest, but it's somewhat limited. And even BPA has limited authority to plan and build ahead of need. I mean, determining that need, again, is the real challenge. And BPA, with its federal oversight and its need to go to the Congress, in effect, to finance any new transmission projects, the fact that it serves a multiple state region makes it difficult even for BPA to plan ahead of need for the long-term clean energy plans of Washington, Oregon, and the other states. So if we go to the next slide. Moving into California a little bit. I know you've had some interest in the California process. California is the CAISO is a single state ISO, the California ISO. So it does have a bit of a clearer line of sight, as I say, to plan transmission for state policy needs. And they really have embedded their process within the sort of infrastructure of state organizations in California. They can do reliability transmission planning, they can do economic transmission planning, and they can do policy-driven transmission planning. They have both formal authority from FERC, but then also from the state to engage in planning ahead of need for policy for policy needs. And again, they're embedded very much within that infrastructure of California government. In effect, they receive from the PUC in California the renewable resource build-outs that are consistent with the state's long-term plans. Through the state IRP process. They then study what transmission is needed to deliver those resources reliably to load, meet the reliability and the clean energy goals. So they do in effect have, again, a broader mandate than some of the other RTOs and most of the other transmission planning entities in the country. If you go to the next slide. Even still, their transmission planning has been largely reactive. It's been largely based on where are the renewable resource developers locating their projects, what transmission service requests, interconnection requests have we received, and if those are all kind of located in a single area, they've done some bundling of those, clustering of those projects into groups and studying transmission for this group of projects rather than one by one. So that's an improvement, but it still has largely been where are renewable developers locating their projects, and less about, you know, over the next 10 or 15 or 20 years, where might we like them to locate their projects. So, and mostly they've done a 10-year out transmission plan. So that kind of lines up with the development timeline anyway. They did now in 2021, for the first time, release what's called a 20-year outlook study. So this was a kind of a new thing that the CAISO wanted to do, just in conjunction with the SB 100 activities with the state agencies, the recognition that really the business as usual is probably not going to work, just given the scale of the build out that's required for California to meet its goals. I look at this as a bit of a dry run. Their resource build out that they used for that study came out of a study that the Energy Commission led, called the SB 100 study. It was an informal study looking broadly at potential needs for new renewable resources. It wasn't formally out over the PUC's IRP process. So it's a bit of a dry run. And even by the time the study was released, some of the assumptions were already a bit outdated. The price tag, as it says, for the transmission that was identified is $30.5 billion. Now that's a big number. It's over 20 years. It's with a lot of increased load, so it doesn't add up to a big impact on rates, but it still is a big number. There's going to be a lot of process that we go through before we determine exactly which of the transmission projects will be needed. And then really the process of moving those long-term projects identified in this outlook study into real projects is still a bit unclear. And if you see the map there, one of the big areas of new need that was identified was offshore wind, 4 to 7 gigawatts of offshore wind in the North Humboldt area, 3 to 4 gigawatts of offshore wind in the Central Coast area. So those are big numbers, and you kind of need the scale to be able to make the offshore wind economic. So I think this kind of a process can be very helpful at identifying what that scale would be, gathering up the momentum needed to get that scale and planning out the transmission projects, not piecemeal, but as a whole. What kind of network do we need to integrate this quantity of offshore wind? So that will be very helpful. The other area of new need that you might see is that Wyoming, Idaho wind on the top right. So 5 gigawatts of out-of-state wind was identified as part of that process. So even here now, and at the bottom right, there's 5 to 6 gigawatts of New Mexico wind as well. So now even here, California isn't big enough to do all of this on its own. For those projects to come to fruition, it's going to have to engage in some kind of an interstate transmission planning process involving its neighboring states as well. So if we go to the next slide. So just to summarize, point one here, maybe it's stating the obvious, but multi-state transmission planning requires cooperation from multiple states. It's really as simple as that. Each state has jurisdiction over the land use in its own area. Each state has jurisdiction over the incorporation of transmission costs into retail rates in its own area. States have a lot of authority, and that's both good and bad in different ways. There currently isn't any entity in the Northwest that can effectively do a long-term forward-looking regional transmission plan. Even in RTO regions, RTOs have the footprint, they have the cost allocation authority. Building ahead of need is a struggle, and states still have siting and permitting authority. So even multi-state RTOs can't, they're not a panacea, it still is hard. And then given kind of where you are now, number 4, my recommendation for moving the ball forward is really informal coordination among the states, the utilities, BPA, and other stakeholders through multi-state working groups, just trying to gather good technical information about which transmission projects might be needed, might be helpful, where they might be located. You can't bind anybody's state siting process. That's a judiciary process that needs to look at the evidence that are in record in the process. So you can't bind those in advance. But you can move the ball a long way with informal coordination and just gathering people together and gathering technical information together. So that I think would be the most promising next step. So I think with that, there is a little bit of time left for questions.
Great, Arnie, thank you. How much time, just so I make sure to manage it, so we don't catch you here?
I got about 10 minutes.
Okay, great. So why don't we see if folks have any questions? I'm going to ask that any reflections and what we should do as the TCWG, we can wait after Sarah's presentation because it dovetails well, but I'd love if folks have any clarification questions for Arnie, that would be awesome. So please hit Alt-Y or the reactions button to raise your hand. I mean, if folks want us to flip back to any of the slides, let us know, we can reshare that. Questions for Arnie?
I have a question in terms of when you talk about California's system, they have a system of both independent IOUs and public entities, but they're more governed under one structure, I think, than Washington's is. Isn't that so?
I think that's fair. Something like 80% of the load in California is served by IOUs or the community choice aggregators that operate in the IOU service areas and are still subject to CPUC jurisdiction. And that's largely contiguous with the ISO footprint. There are some municipal utilities in the ISO as well, City of Palo Alto, for example. So it's not entirely clean like that. But yeah, the PUC has a lot of authority over the planning, procurement activities of those entities, and their footprint is pretty close to contiguous with the CAISO. There is some informal coordination with Sacramento Municipal Utility District and the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power as well, but they run their own separate balancing areas, sort of like Seattle and Tacoma.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. I've got Glenn.
Good morning, Arnie. I wondered about the role of the Bonneville Power Administration in doing the planning that you're talking about here for the Northwest. And I know that BPA does a lot of transmission planning itself for its own system, and then it also participates in Northern Grid. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on how BPA could be most effective at, kind of planning out the overall transmission system, and in particular doing that in a way that reflects both the Washington and Oregon clean electricity requirements, with that, those two states being such a big part of its service area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's exactly the right question to ask. And I see that Anders Johnson is on the call as well and participating in this group. So, Bonneville has the right footprint. They have historically done most of the high voltage transmission planning and construction for especially the Washington and Oregon regions, but also connecting over into Western Montana. So if there is any entity that has some ability to do transmission planning for a large footprint, it's Bonneville. But as everything with Bonneville, it's complex. It has, preference customers, public power entities. It also has wholesale transmission customers, which are a different set of customers and with a different set of needs. To what extent does Bonneville's transmission planning activities touch those other wholesale customers? Some of those wholesale customers have loads all the way out in Utah, outside of the Bonneville area. There's lots of always complexity whenever DOE and Washington, DC is involved. So I think that's the right question to ask, is what role can Bonneville proactively play, just given the sort of organic and statutory restrictions that it has on its abilities.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Arnie. Clint, then Lorna, and then Anders. Clint.
Arnie, this is Clint. I appreciate your conversation on the RTO. I can see the definite benefit for that for planning purposes, particularly in the complex Northwest area. My question is on the potential allocation of costs for overbuilding of transmission and to meet the overbuilding of renewables. And how does that cost get allocated in comparison to if it was just base load generation instead of overbuilding of renewables, transmission for renewables?
Yeah, it's a good question. outside of RTO regions, developers will typically have to front some money to pay for transmission projects. Then they get that refunded as they purchase transmission service from the utility over time. So in effect, it's a prepayment, and as long as their payments for transmission service exceed the cost of the line, then everyone's happy. In the RTO regions, the costs are typically allocated to loads. So really, it would depend on which loads are benefiting from those transmission projects, and it's a very challenging exercise. And most of them have some relatively simplistic formula. High voltage is allocated across a larger area, low voltage is allocated across a smaller area. And there's always a lot of contention. Is this new project really needed? And in California, some of the municipal utilities are very active at, carefully scrutinizing the CAISO's plans to say, we don't want to pay the bill for this project because we don't need it for our service. So that's always the question of how you figure out what's needed and how you allocate those costs. Now the RTOs can allocate the costs, but then in some ways puts even more pressure on that question of, is this project really needed or not? And the question of, and particularly building ahead of need, we're trying to think about doing proactive transmission planning. It's easy to say, here's my list of projects that have asked for service. That's why I need this transmission project. It's harder when you say, I want to proactively plan some transmission, because I think and hope and expect that renewables will locate offshore, or they'll locate in these specific areas that all my studies say are a good place to locate.
Great. Thank you, Clint. Thank you, Arnie. So I've got Lorna, then Anders and Katie. Lorna?
Yeah, and I'll just try to go really quick. Super helpful, Arnie, all of this. Can you just put in context, CAISO, the work they've done, the challenges they have, kind of where they are in the timeline versus Washington State, because we're getting off coal in 2025, and that's going to change a lot of transmission needs. California's been off coal, just can you compare California versus Washington in terms of kind of the transmission transformation process?
Yeah, CAISO has been at this for quite a while. It's been really 10 years now since we had our 33% RPS statute passed, and people started looking at are the transmission planning processes adequate? We had our renewable energy transmission initiative in kind of the 2011, 2012, 2013 timeframe to identify corridors, to identify potential transmission lines, identify areas where of high wind quality and high solar quality. So I think all of that work is foundational. It's important, again, just to gather people together, gather good technical information together to make it easier to identify projects and get them through the process. So I would say transmission hasn't been a big barrier, as much of a barrier as we expected it to be 10, 15 years ago when we were looking out. What that isn't to say that it won't be going forward, because our needs are only increasing from here.
Thank you, Arnie. Thank you, Lorna. Arnie, do we have you for 2 more minutes?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you. We really deeply appreciate it. Anders?
Yeah, just to comment on in response to a couple of those other questions. Yeah, I think there's definitely a need to keep processing the open access transmission tariff-based requests, but I think also in parallel having that longer term look and really identifying the right balance between the supply of renewables that'll be needed to meet the load growth forecasts and the policy targets, and matching up the supply and demand, I think will be important to get the right amount of transmission. And sometimes the request-driven process just has the supply side, but maybe I think that's something where through regional planning or with the states and the utilities and BPA working together, we can hopefully get the right balance and then come up with how much transmission is really needed, and then get commitments from those who would use it or benefit from it to get it built.
Thank you, Anders. Katie?
Thanks, Arnie. So given your recommendation for informal coordination among states, we do have an idea that maybe I'll share some more about, we'll talk more about later, but given your time limitation, my question that I want to ask is around FERC's notice of proposed rulemaking on regional planning and cost allocation. I'm curious if you have any feel for how that rulemaking might end up changing the way RTOs plan on a system-wide basis and potentially relieve some of the tension that you mentioned caused by the state level involvement.
It's a good question. People ask the same question about Order 1000, 10, 12 years ago, which, really set up these regional transmission entities like Northern Grid to do regional planning, but didn't vest them with cost allocation authority. So the states are still in some ways a roadblock to development planning of regional projects. So FERC recognizes that. But what it feels to me like they've done is said, okay, we see that the states are and continue to be a roadblock. We'd like you states to go figure it out. We'd like you to figure out if you can voluntarily agree on a way to do cost allocation, because that would make all of this easier. So, to the extent that you need to get together with other states and respond to FERC and say, here's what we think we can do, that's helpful. So if it helps and engage the states with each other, then that's helpful. It's still, but given FERC's limitations on FERC's authority in this area, I think I see this as being probably as far as they can go. But they really are kind of now laying the buck again in your court to say, why don't you all get together and figure out how we can do this in a way that removes the hurdle and removes the roadblock.
Awesome. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Arnie. Arnie, 9:35. I know that you have to be on stage in about 5 minutes somewhere else, so we really appreciate your time. Thank you. If we have any follow-up, we can handle that via emails, but thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Yeah, no, you're very welcome. It's a pleasure. And yeah, my contact information is on the back slide. So thank you.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so that last question that Katie asked, I'm invite that folks have that in the back of their mind now that we go to Sarah's presentation. So we're fire hosing you with information about ways that we can enhance the existing conversations that we've already had. And that we've already documented, with a question being, in light of what we talked about and learned today from Arnie and Sarah, are there changes that we want to make to the final report that incorporate our learnings from today? So Sarah, I have to change a quick setting to allow you to share your screen because I lock everything down. And then Sarah, you should be able to now share your screen and take it away. I ask maybe 15, 20 minutes-ish, so we have time for questions, and then we're going to roll right into discussion. Thank you, Sarah.
Great, and can you all see my screen? Okay, perfect. Well, I couldn't have asked for a nicer intro that Arnie gave to set up my conversation. So good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah Vorpal. I'm a manager at the Washington State Energy Office, working on federal energy policy and strategic alignment with state energy goals. So today I'm just going to very briefly about what that role is, and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, but then really dive into a program that was recently released in terms of just notice of information from DOE, from the Federal Department of Energy on transmission. So hopefully it'll just get us to the ask that Rob had, which is, thinking about what we need for Washington. So that's where I'll end up today, kind of putting it forward some of my own recommendations that really dovetail nicely with what Arnie was saying, hopefully. Okay. And there we go. So coming from the Department of Commerce, where we administer a lot of money to a lot of different things, probably y'all know that by now. So just a quick dance through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, IIJA, BIL, you might have heard all these things. Passed in November of 21, just a historic investment in core infrastructure, not only for transmission and energy and grid, but a lot of other things as well. There's a lot of focus as well on a particular rural investment and dedicating major money to real projects. A good note for any ARA survivors out there. When ARA was about getting money, the American Reinvestment Act that was passed in the Obama administration, that was about getting money out as quickly as possible to reinvigorate the economy after the crash. The IIJA is about building infrastructure and long-term thinking, theoretically. And so all the buckets of money that we're talking about are not one-time funding. They're set up as reoccurring equal amounts of funding over 5 fiscal years, 22 to 26. So it's just a whole different kind of approach. And I just want to kind of caveat that at the beginning, because it'll be very overwhelming, all the opportunity. But the good news is that we hopefully have some time to do some planning to really take advantage in the later years of these programs. So how much are we talking about? Of the almost $1 trillion, about half, or 550 billion, is for new investments. And so as you can see, it's not just for energy and grid, it's for broadband, water. The majority is for transportation, resiliency efforts, climate mitigation, and water infrastructure. So if we zoom in on that energy and power, that's where we're going to talk about the transmission program today. Just a real quick note, though, on my role, because it is new, and some of you I may know from my previous role in the State Energy Office, working as an energy specialist and working on CETA. This role is really about thinking about how we strategize on all this money. So here is the idealized process of how this works. Isn't it beautiful? There's clean, simple boxes, and we can figure this all out in a really nice, straightforward way. So we identify some opportunities. We really want to make sure that as we're identifying those federal funding opportunities, we're thinking about how to coordinate across agencies, incorporate a meaningful equity analysis that's in line with state law, as well as Justice 40 initiative at the federal level, and ensuring travel outreach and coordination. Once we kind of do iterative process of that, putting teams together to actually go after these funds. A lot of these things are starting out as requests for information, so writing responses for that, planning for applications, and then eventually applying. So that is hopefully how my job will run. But then also, this is what the reality looks like. This is the current map of all federal opportunities, most of which are related to IIJA. So you can see it's a lot. We're talking about a lot of money, a lot of new programs, and brand new programs that DOE has never done, and a lot of opportunity, though. So don't worry about taking all this in right now. I'll make sure this information gets to you in case you want to go through it, and you can check out some of the DOE websites. But just to give you a sense of what we're talking about. So the transmission facilitation program here at the top right is but one of many that include, battery manufacturing. There's a new interconnection and innovation exchange to think about how to streamline interconnection processes for projects, for renewable energy projects, hydrogen hubs, electric vehicles, et cetera. Okay, so now we can burrow in a little bit more. I will not purport to be an expert on transmission or this program. I am just learning as you are. So a lot of my job is reading a lot of DOE websites and going to a lot of webinars. So I shamelessly stole all of these lovely slides from a DOE webinar that happened last week on this program. So I'm going to walk through these to present the information here because I think amplifying it is important. The more comprehensive set, as well as a recording and frequently asked questions, are available on DOE's website. So I will, answer what I know based on what I've, learned, but I also encourage folks to take a deeper dive into the information that's on the website. And again, all of that will be sent. I'll make sure Ross has all that information for you. So highlighted in yellow, you see the transmission facilitation program. And as you can see, it's nestled in a whole lot of other work around transmission that DOE is doing. So, in addition to the financing tools, there's transmission planning, including a new kind of revamped transmission needs study that will identify these transmission corridors in the United States. And that is being kind of led by a bunch of people, by a work group. And I believe Anna Leasing from the governor's office is participating in that work group. So Washington's at the table, good to know. And then there will be some other targeted planning studies as well. They're also, I think, generally, DOE is really trying to understand how to work with communities to do infrastructure planning. And so there's this engagement and collaboration for all the kind of stakeholders you see at the left here, that they're really trying to better understand, how do you identify benefits? What does that mean to communities? How do you work with communities to get these jobs done, states and tribes as well? So kind of more information about how to do that. Justice 40 initiative also really puts that down as a mandate in a lot of this funding. Again, streamlining for the permitting process. So things that really track with a lot of the conversations in the states, thinking about, how they do permitting for the federal agencies. And then still thinking about innovation. Of course, they are DOE, they have an office of, science, and they do a lot of research. So thinking about what next generation technologies look like. Here in the middle, the financing tools, we've got the TCP, which I'll talk about a little bit more in depth. And then we have a suite of grid resilience programs. The third bullet, the Grid Resilience Grants for States, is a formula program that will be run out of Commerce, and it'll be formula funds of about 11.7 million a year for Washington every year for 5 years to support grid resilience. More to come on that. And then existing loan guarantee programs. And again, check those out. The Loans Program Office, which has existed for a while, that got reinvigorated in IIJA, as well as the WAPA Transmission Infrastructure Program. I don't know much about that program, but I'll send a link in case folks want to learn more. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to move fast. So hang on and we'll get to the end here. So the Transmission Facilitation Program will have 3 different mechanisms: capacity contract, public-private partnership, and loans. The capacity contracts is the first solicitation, will be only for capacity contracts. The other 2 will roll out later. So there's not great details on the second 2. What I can tell you about the public-private partnerships, the one interesting note I saw was that it mentioned that because DOE is participating, that there is an ability to bypass the NEPA process. I didn't understand it well. There was a couple sentences about it in the small description of the P3 in the NOAA, so I'd definitely go take a look to learn more. The loans currently will be run a lot like the Loans Program Office. And again, they're still developing guidance. For capacity contracts, DOE can serve as an anchor tenant on new and upgraded transmission lines by buying up to 50% of the planned commercial capacity for up to 40 years. We can even give you some more information. So, I think the idea here is basically DOE can participate in these projects and be a partner when if there's not an entity that can take that on. So there's a lot of what I can only imagine is very high level and ambiguous detail for folks that are experts in transmission planning in the NOAA. So I'm not going to try to speak over my skis here, but you can take a look at this information and just know that they're going to be doing a capacity contract workshop through DOE in August. So I think that they're really still trying to get a lot more details. They're also getting requests for information responses are due in June 13th on Monday. And so hopefully with that information, with those questions and response to how these programs are being set up at a very high level, they'll be able to provide more information. So eligible entities are as follows. All types of utilities, independent transmission project developers, states, tribes, and other government entities. So a lot, a lot of people are eligible entities. I think the big note here is, of course, that states are eligible entities. That's interesting. I don't quite know what it means, but it'll be interesting to think about. And, that with this broad opportunity, it means that there's just a lot of possibilities based on those 3 different mechanisms. So there are a lot of different ways that this can happen. So eligible projects must include construction of a new or replacement transmission, upgrade, or connection of isolated microgrids. I don't think the third one applies as much to Washington. So I think that's really, more about islanded communities. So really focusing on the first 2, that helps us kind of just get a sense of what we're talking about. So this is just the very basic high level. And of course, I made the mistake of putting all my notes in the notes that I can't see, but there's more details about these in terms of what else you need to include, some kind of principles from DOE. Oh, I did include them, pardon me. So you have to be able to enhance capacity, efficiency, and resilience. So really focusing on that resilience and reliability piece. And so many of the DOE IIJA programs focus on resilience, I'll say. I think DOE is really trying to understand how to create metrics around resilience. And for utilities in Washington State, that's really relevant, especially for CETA compliance, I think, given that it's one of the ways that an indicator you can use for equitable distribution of benefits. So kind of an interesting note there. Facilitate interregional transfer capacity. So, you're wanting that increases economic growth. So really being able to, some of those lines out of the state in that CAISO report, right? Where are you being able to bring in transmission that's actually going to increase economic growth in different regions? How are you actually bolstering that? And then good note that you also, there's also an aspect of lowering greenhouse gas emissions that is part of this consideration. So obviously that really lines up with Washington State and our region well. Interestingly, DOE did not have a slide on this, so I wanted to pull it out of the notice of intent. There are also equity and labor requirements. So, you know, that you need to do community engagement. You need to, like, there will be these principles around equity, environment, and energy justice, EEJ, if you see that acronym, that will need to be part of projects. You'll have to incorporate EJ principles that will line up with Justice 40, which is the federal environmental justice initiative from the Biden-Harris administration. And then also that you'll need to support good paying union jobs and hybrid workforce development. So whatever project you have, as I'm understanding it, you need to be able to show that you're going to create a union workforce and incorporate things like project labor agreements and community benefit agreements into those contracts and things. So it's named, it's not named, the details are not much more than that though, but I wanted to make sure folks knew about that. Okay, so as I mentioned, DOE is phasing this in. So they're planning a phased approach for the solicitations. They say, if all goes as planned, starting in 2022 for capacity contracts. And then the second phase would include all three mechanisms later in 2023. And then the projects would have to be completed for this first phase by the end of 2027. I suspect, without knowing, that those timelines will get pushed back a little after they get those RFI responses in, but who knows, they could continue if they have enough specifics on projects that would be ready to go. Part of the RFI is asking about which projects would be ready to go for this solicitation. So I think they're trying to get a sense of that. So if you're interested, the request for information is looking at these topics and it's due on Monday. You know, basically, what do you think about the sequencing? How do you think about the review? So there's, again, if you go look at the details and the notice of intent, there's quite a lot that they're asking for in terms of, you know, information about the project. So I can say a little bit more about that. Pardon me. For example, how does it line up with regional long-term transmission planning? How does it, you have to show that by getting this funding, it would be addressing barriers that you wouldn't be able to address without the funding. So you have to be able to baseline like what the project would be and how it would be facilitated by this funding. And then there's a bunch of kind of points about that in there. You have to show that it's supporting all of the principles that were on the previous slide that DOE has about transmission facilitation planning. So, you know, just a lot there to consider and see if that's reasonable. First of all, I guess is what they're asking, but you know, are there things they're not considering? Do you need more details to understand what they're asking? I'm sure there's a lot of those types of questions. Yes, and then I think the other big one, and it really dovetails with what Arnie was talking about, is, you know, how DOE will measure the benefits of proposed projects. And this goes into like the cost of the projects, right? And it also dovetails with the FERC NOPR. I will not even pretend to have read 450 pages of FERC NOPR to feel like I can speak eloquently about how those things intersect, but how you cost out and measure benefits and you know how states are thinking about that based on their laws is really going to be important. Yeah, and then just kind of the more administrative and legalistic aspects of the contracts themselves. So again, next steps, there was a public webinar, you can see the slides. RFI comments due, a technical conference on capacity contracts in August. September 2022 is theoretically when they're releasing the phase 1 solicitations for the capacity contracts only, but keep your eyes open. After the RFI response, they might again change these timelines. So I'm actually going to pause there. I know I don't have a ton of time left and I might have actually already gone over it. I'm just going to put these questions up for us to look at, and I'll just read them. This is the kind of thing I'm considering in my role, and I don't have answers to. So if someone can answer all these questions, that's great because you've done my job for me. But when I look through this solicitation, I think of these questions. The top two, I'd actually be most curious if folks could put in the chat or follow up with me. if you are planning to submit an RFI response, and if you are considering or feel like you might be eligible for a first phase project, I'd be very interested to know, who's doing that in the state. And then otherwise, just thinking about the next phases of this revolving fund. So it's a $2.5 billion revolving fund. So we're going to have some time here. Who's the point person or entity in the state for coordination? Kind of goes to exactly this principle you all are trying to figure out. What is the opportunity for Washington with this program, right? Like, looking at this, I just don't know like how I'd answer a question like, how would this funding help overcome barriers, and how would we think about that? And really, what could the impact be for Washington? And so to answer that, what planning needs to happen in advance of future applications? And then really, again, hitting on these 3 points that I think for me are really deeply a part of my role. How does the state ensure tribal entities are involved early and consulted often on any kind of developing project? How do we best engage labor early to plan for workforce development? These are huge undertakings that I'm sure require a lot of new different kinds of certifications and trainings. How do we ensure we have a pipeline of workforce ready to go for what the state needs to do? And how do we ensure an equitable and transparent process? So just kind of end, I'll just leave this slide up and can take questions, but my thoughts very much in line, I feel like, with what Arnie was saying and actually what you all are discussing today. Just being able to appoint a transmission planning lead for the state, or a point person to coordinate with all the other entities that is a state agency person, developing a transmission planning roadmap. And so I actually, had the CAISO 20-year transmission outlook in mind, as well as the PJM regional transmission expansion plan. Again, those are being done in, organized markets. So we'd have to think about how to adopt this for Washington, but lots of good information in there. And then just continuing to follow the FERC NOPR on transmission planning and cost allocation. So that'll be comments for that are going to be due in August, I believe. So I believe they got pushed back a bit. So we have some time there. And with that, I'll stop and hand it back to Rob. Thanks for your time today.
Sarah, thank you. There's a question that came in. Is the state planning on submitting any information as part of the RFI?
I am not aware of anybody that is currently doing that. If a state agency, state person is interested in doing that, I know we have a short window, but I'm happy to help make that happen. So I'd love someone to get in touch if we do want to do something. Okay. I wasn't quite clear if it was what we had to say at this point. So I'm just trying to learn.
Okay, so this is what I'd like to do. It feels to me as if any questions that folks might have for Sarah might bleed into the conversation we plan to have following the 2 presentations. So I just want to allow that bleed to happen. And so I want to see if folks have any questions for Sarah about what she did, any reflections on the set of presentations. And so I'm really interested in having folks begin sharing with one another what they're seeing and what they're hearing. Before I do that, I want to tell you 2 things. The first is Susan is going to be working behind the scenes to in real time try to listen to what folks are saying and see if there is some conversions of thoughts around things to be drafting like principal language for us to take a look at. So we're in a funny stage where we have to build the plane and fly it since it's meeting 6. And so we're all building it and flying it together. And Susan's going to be trying to actively listen and, pull content from the existing report if that exists so that we can come back to you if it's appropriate today or tomorrow with specific suggestions for how we might augment the existing content. That's the first thing. The second thing is that there are 2 principles in the existing document that directly relate to this. There's a principle that talks about an RTO, and then there's a principle that is generic that talks about the need to expand a regional coordination that I do think we have the opportunity to go deeper on if folks are interested. So that's the process that we're going to be doing behind the scenes, where we're at with the document. So what I'd like to do now is, in the next 25 or 30 minutes, I want to hear from folks. see folks have questions. Sarah, where are you at? What popped out in your head as you heard those conversations? What do you think is the right thing for Washington State to do? What do you think should be in our report around it? Yeah, Katie, please jump in.
Thanks, Rob. Before we get into the language of the document and recommendations we want to see, I appreciate the conversation Sarah has started here. And I know that that deadline is looming, but before we move on from this funding conversation, I wanted to ask Sarah if she's tracking the Smart Grid Investment Grant Program, which is also led by the U.S. Department of Energy and is more focused on like reliability elements, would be more appropriate for like grid enhancing technologies, non-wires alternative type things. And I know that I think that application period is open. I might be wrong, but correct me if I'm wrong, Sarah, but approximately $3 billion would be available from 2022 to 2026 for this program as part of that Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And a 50% match is required there as well. So curious if Sarah is tracking that, and if so, if she has any idea around deadlines and whatnot.
Thanks, Katie, for the question. Yeah, so the program, and I have all my notes in this board over here, so pardon me, I'm gonna look away. You're talking about the competitive grant program for upgrading our electric grid and ensuring reliability and resilience. So yeah, that's a $5 billion competitive grant, $1 billion a year for the next 5 years. It does all the things you say. Eligible entities are states or collections of states, tribes, local governments, and PUCs. That program is not currently open, and there has not been any solicitation as far as I know. If anyone has seen one, please let me know. I will drop in the chat. So I dropped in the specific thing for the transmission facilitation program. The next link I just put in is a clearinghouse where DOE puts up every single solicitation or any new information about the IIJA program. So this is something I check daily. And so I was just double checking about the Smart Grid grants. I believe more information about those is coming out in the next couple of months, Katie. So definitely tracking, be very curious to see the design of the program because it has some interesting requirements that I've heard whispered of, but I haven't actually seen on paper. So I'll let you know. And then just so you know, that part of the kind of grid resilience package also includes the money, the formula grant money that I mentioned that's for states and tribes. So all states and all federally recognized tribes will have an allocation formula that allows them access to some amount of money that is specifically for grid resilience measures, building actual things like underground wires and substations. Also includes funding for workforce development. It requires writing a plan and holding a public hearing. The timeline for that is theoretically, the program will have information starting July 1st, and then states and tribes will have 60 days to create a plan and do a public hearing. I believe there will be a lot of pushback on that, and so we're hoping to get a 6-month extension on that. But that is a formula program that will address the same thing. And then there will be these competitive competitive programs that will sort of complement. And then the other one is another competitive program that will be more focused on industry. And that's an extension of the old Smart Grid program under ARA. And that will be $3 billion or $600 million a year for 5 years. And that is also going to be an interesting one. That will be for utilities, but you'll have to show that you've done, it's kind of based on work that you've done in the past around resilience measures. So again, some interesting murmurings about the requirements of those programs. We're really waiting for more information from DOE, which is not coming as fast as all of us would like. So hopefully that answers your question. But if you do find anything, Katie, that I've missed, please don't hesitate to send it to me.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Sarah. So 2 questions in the chat having to do specifically with that last slide you put up. The first question was on the recommendation of transmission planning lead from the state. Are there discussions going on, like in the energy office or the governor's office, about where that person would live and what their portfolio would look like? And then the second part of that question is on the second one about developing a transmission roadmap. are you aware of any discussions within the state that are underway? And then any ideas you have of, who would be at the table, where does the table live, about the implementation of it?
And here, Stu, I thought you were going to have the answer to those questions for me. So, those are great questions that I think need discussing, and I hope that is what will come out of this conversation y'all are having today. My feeling is I think there's a pretty good design in how this could be done that happened with the hydrogen work. So, the governor appointed our director, Lisa Brown, to be in charge of kind of figuring out what we want to do about hydrogen and how we could create a roadmap and figure out how to apply for a federal program for hydrogen hubs. So Commerce has, been working across a lot of different entities to also create this nonprofit organization called the Pacific Northwest Hydrogen Association that will be the entity that applies for that federal funding. Now, that last part with the kind of the 501c3, that doesn't need to be part of this conversation. But I think the model of having the governor be able to appoint a person to figure out a point person or figure out a point person, to me, seems like a good method just to, really ensure some clarity, or at least a process to clarity. So at that table, I imagine would be, the state agency family. Because for me, this entity is, it's not necessarily the lead person making all the decisions on transmission planning, but it's the lead state entity to help coordinate on all these things that have really ambiguous, kind of jurisdictional issues. Because when it's very diffuse, I imagine that can be very hard to know how to actually make decisions sometimes. So that was my thinking there. And know from what I know, other than kind of whatever is happening in this room here, there's an analogous conversation around siting in the siting work group that we're doing across the road here. So, I think, and I just mean virtual road because it's on the next meeting on my calendar. And, in there, the question is similar. We don't necessarily have, with respect to clean energy, kind of an heir apparent for, who the point person is for citing clean energy projects in the state. We have new jurisdiction that FSTEC has, and they're building, as they're becoming their own agency. We have, a lot of new need and a lot of interest. We just got a lot happening. So, really trying to think about across the state agency family, how do we decide, how do we make decisions? I think it's a real question, right? And so again, it need not be the point person or one entity. Perhaps it's a group of people or a body of people, given the complexity and cross-cutting nature of these things. But I imagine that, and I think Diane Buderek is also on this group, right? That there is a lot of analogous need there. So perhaps a conversation between those two groups too, to understand, how they might work together and not duplicate efforts. And then Stu, to your second question, it's very similar. I don't know that there is any specific conversation happening. Other folks from utilities have sent me, these plans and said, hey, it would be great if there was a roadmap like this for Washington. So Uzma Siddiqui, I think a lot of you probably know, who's just a really good thought partner on these things, had noticed the PJM work and thought, wow, this could be something that would be really useful for Washington State. And so I think, just thinking about, though, not in an ISO, like what would we actually need to solve for, and how you do a 20-year outlook in our region. Are we going to be doing kind of that geographical block aspect the way California did it? Is it more just kind of a laundry list of what you need to meet future load based on our, scenarios that we have for clean energy? Is it a process to understand, how to coordinate around some of those regulatory issues? It could be a lot of things. And so I think there's a good way to start with those two.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Stu. Okay, so I now do definitely want to make a hard pivot for folks on this group to reflect on what is it that you think is important that we say in the transportation corridors work group final report about this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip up on the screen here really quick the two recommendations that we have on planning, because I think that is the starting point, so folks can see where we landed. And for folks who are not able to see it on the Zoom, I'm going to be going to no one's seeing on the Zoom because I haven't shared my screen yet. We're going to go to E7 and 8, which are the principles that show up. E is the section of the document that has the principles for transportation planning. And so the principles that are there are right here. We've got a principle that says expand regional planning coordination, strengthen regional, interstate, and international utility coordination, ensure effective and coordinated transmission planning. And so that to me kind of reflects the lightest touch possible in terms of regional planning. All we're calling for here is an expansion of it, but there's not a sense of what that could look like. And then we've got a principle in there about the need to continue the exploration of an RTO. So that's what we currently have in the report. So what I'm really interested in hearing from folks is where and how, if at all, do they want to see these principles changed? Do we have a gap in here having to do with the state need? Do we have a gap here having to do with a plan development as opposed to planning coordination? I want to hear where folks are at. Yeah, Anders, please.
On that bullet 8 there, one suggestion would be to add creation of an RTO or an expanded day-ahead market.
I'm sorry, an expanded what, Anders?
Day-ahead market. There's that would be a smaller step than an RTO, but it would also create opportunities to allow for the more efficient dispatch of resources and transmission congestion management. And there's some proposals that are being actively developed and circulated right now in the West. There's one that from CAISO, and there's another from Southwest Power Pool. Mm-hmm. And so those are, in terms of a nearer term action that would lead to some of those efficiencies. That's probably worth having on the list too, because that might be more doable.
Anders,
than the full RTO would be.
This is Kathleen. Maybe you can take a minute or two to explain that a little more. That would be in conjunction with an existing market, right?
There's currently the energy imbalance market, which is kind of more for real time, and this would expand it to day ahead. And the big difference versus an RTO is that the transmission providers would still keep their open access transmission tariffs, but it would still create more of those opportunities in the looking out more like in a day ahead horizon.
So would we do it as, I guess,
in the West?
Sorry, but I'm trying to understand, would we do that as a region, or would we do it in conjunction with CAISO or Southwest? I'm trying to understand what how that would happen.
I can post a link to some of the proposals in the chat, but it could be a broader footprint across the West, and it would likely be coordinated by one of the existing market operators.
Okay. That's what was my assumption. So I kind of just wanted to explore that a little bit. But what I hear you saying is that would be a step to participate in that, to start getting greater efficiencies in transmission.
Yeah. I just think that concept of those day ahead markets is probably an important one also, to not only RTO.
Okay, great. Thank you, Anders. Thank you, Kathleen. I've got Nicholas. Yeah.
So I guess I want to push back just a little bit on Anders' suggestion. Not that I think it's wrong. I actually think it's right. I think that's expanded market operational opportunities is a good idea. But it does seem a little outside of the scope of a transmission corridors work group, because I see the reason why we are talking about RTOs is the planning aspect of RTOs, not so much the operational aspects. And so I wonder if it's just, getting outside of our lane a little bit. But so that's my own.
Okay, great. Great. Thank you, Anders. And so again, I just want to help in and focus the conversation on what I'm looking for. Obviously, suggestions like Nicholas and Anders had, but I'm also interested as in folks' perspective about the question of the coordination challenges and opportunities that Arnie and Sarah described. Is there a need to add a principle, amend these principles, particularly as it pertains to what Washington State needs to do to get the house in order? I've got Katie, then Glenn. Katie?
Well, first, I was going to flag Glenn's comment in the chat, just because I think, it goes along with what has just been said, but that this day ahead addition might get at more of what the current transmission system can do, but not necessarily a future build out in gaining efficiencies there. And along with that, I wanted to kind of add something to respond to what you just mentioned, which is this potential addition of something that's more specific in the principles after hearing what Arnie has discussed and Sarah. And we have been thinking about that at Renewable Northwest, and we've also been speaking with entities who may be able to help with this sort of informal coordination among states and on a more regional basis, a wider footprint to do things more efficiently and potentially eliminate redundancy of multiple studies done by different states at different time periods, and looking at different factors in those studies. So if we were to get perhaps WEC, and I know I've spoken about this with certain people on this call, to explore cost benefit analysis of having an RTO versus a business as usual scenario for the transmission build out that we need to meet our clean energy mandates. Again, would help avoid that redundancy, would help encourage regional coordination with regard to transmission, especially anticipating what might come out of FERC's notice of proposed rulemaking. And it would be a third-party neutral entity that wouldn't have any stake in the results of the study and would be able to take like a really holistic perspective and look at kind of state policy and other factors that would help build a really strong study and help capture the most transmission efficiencies to meet our needs. So again, WEC, we've already spoken with them. They do have the funding. They have to figure out timing and whatnot, and I can keep in touch with EPSAC and whoever about that as we learn more. But we have been speaking with them and things are in the works there. So if that feels right, then maybe we don't mention WEC in the principle, but we could sort of shape the principle to say kind of what we would want them to do, and then kind of secure that entity later.
Great. Katie, thank you. I've got Glenn and then Clint. Glenn, please.
Thanks. And I have to say, I'm really interested in the idea that Katie has brought forward here, and look forward to learning more about it. And I don't want to diminish the idea of a regional transmission organization at all. I think it could help with the coordination of planning, also with the more efficient use of the transmission system that we already have. So exploring that is a really good element of getting to additional transmission capacity. But I think that somewhat separately from that, for us to say more than we do right now in Principle 7 about the coordinated planning itself, for us to say more about why we need it would be helpful. It would strengthen the report. And so I put some language in the chat as a suggestion about how to expand on that. I think one part of, Arnie said something more like an informal organization might be a good idea. And I think that at least in the short term, that may be the best we can do. For instance, I don't want us to say, well, first let's do a regional transmission organization, and then they can be the ones to do the proactive long-term planning, because you put those two things together and you're talking about a long time before you actually get to, figuring out what we need, where we need it. And so to go ahead and start now with our existing institutions and organizations, but to try to move in the direction of a more proactive plan that looks at all the needs, not just individual utility needs. And if at all possible, do that on a regional basis, I think would be a really good strengthening of our recommendation here.
Glenn, thank you. Clint, you're up next.
Can I get a clarification on some of what I'm hearing on Sarah's proposal for the transmission facilitation program? Because I think I was hearing that the state has a potential of being able to apply for some of that DOE funding. And if that's the case, are we talking about a state organization kind of like WSDOT, but for transmission line, that the state would potentially build a transmission line instead of advocating for a regional transmission organization? And if that's the case, wouldn't that, to me, it kind of makes sense. We don't rely on private groups or local communities to do our state highway planning, and shouldn't we at a state level be doing our own transmission planning? It sounds weird, but can I get a clarification? What are we asking the state to do here?
Sarah, do you want to reflect on that?
Oh boy, I would like to ask not to call it Sarah's transmission plan idea, but yes, that's a great question, Clint. I think it mostly for me, it's that the opportunity exists. It begs the question of what's the value of what you just proposed. And I don't think I have a good sense of that, right? And I think the next question under that is, well, how much transmission are we talking about? What is going to be the need, right? And then under that is, where is that going to happen and with whom? And so, right. So, and then that leads me to this kind of what I think Glenn put in the chat about this kind of 20-year outlay and thinking about how to even get a first cut at that question. So I think the CAISO report that Arnie talked about is really instructive, right? Like, and as he said, again, it was just even a first guess, but it would help us even get a sense of that conversation. I think also thinking about the who would really be facilitated by understanding what's the definition of the lead entity? What are they going to do? What's their role? What would they actually be working on, right? And that could be really different here than it is in other places. I think also, that happens in conjunction with a lot of other things, right? So there's still all of the, BPA and all the other entities doing their planning and able to, go after funding as well. There's, possibly an RTO that would bring kind of a different atmosphere, but I think regardless, you need a point person to then even start being able to understand what's the benefit, of Washington going after this. I mean, I also saw a question in the chat about DNR, right? Because I kind of got a different relationship to the executive, but thinking about their mission, right? Like they are right now thinking about how to put more solar on their land because it's a better cost benefit than some of the existing land uses. So what does the land use for transmission look like? Where does it go over, and who would have jurisdiction over that? I think, someone like DNR, might be interested in that, and especially if it's on their land. So again, it's also, where is this happening? So lots of questions that I would have to answer to know what the state should be doing, I think. So hopefully that wasn't too roundabout or confusing.
It seems like the best way for to achieve the state's objectives is for the state to be involved in it. And
yes. I mean, yes. Not
right.
being passive. Yeah, no, I agree with that, Clint. And I think that just even getting that first step. So also just in terms of timeline, because I think that's a question, and you're probably addressing it in the report, getting those questions started now. So I'm talking about like a decision package for the 23 session that says like let's direct a work group to figure out, those, at least get started on those questions, maybe even formulate the questions, right? But at least get a lay of the land, getting a roadmap started and starting to figure out the who and around the lead entity. I have no idea what people think. I'd be very interested to know what people think about, a transmission focused office, but maybe people don't feel like fighting on that today. So anyway.
Thank you.
Thank you, Clint. Thank you, Sarah. Katie, I saw that you had your hand up and you put your hand down. I did have a follow-up question for you. In the conversations that you had with WEC, the conversation that Clint and Sarah had about options for how to organize, how to organize that, would that be what you would think would be in the scope of what the WEC is doing?
It could be. The study hasn't been constructed yet, and there can be opportunities for input there. What I was going to add, I think Sarah captured well enough, so I put my hand back down. But I think what she said in terms of having a point at the state who is involved in all of these transmission planning efforts and injecting sort of the state's perspective is what we need, and sort of kind of what we're lacking. And so that's what I was going to voice, but I think that she did it well, very well. So, and then also voicing the danger of if we were to look at this in sort of like a state incubator sort of way, the risk of overbuild in sort of multiple ways would be higher, and that's why taking a regional perspective would just be more efficient and would reduce that risk of overbuild. So I wanted to voice that. But in terms of what would come out of a study at WEC and how the state would go back and do something with that information, I think that could be a part of like the end goal of a study. Put action items to it.
Great. Thank you, Katie. So I'm going to invite folks up there on the screen, and also in the chat was a suggestion from Glenn on what it might look like to recast number 7 some. And so I know I'm asking folks to give me their real-time reactions, but how does this feel? As you try it on for size for the first time here, that beyond just the current language which is in the regular color font, that we enhance number 7 there to look something more like what Glenn proposed in the chat.
Rob, if I could make a suggestion, maybe if we could ask in some way if people are interested and positive towards it, concerned about it, or feel negative about it, because it is a lot to take in.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
to provide an actual response. So kind of more of a gauge of where you are on this.
Yeah, Kathleen, thank you. So maybe as a process going forward, we'll get that gauge now, and then we're not going to land it today. We'll distribute the specific language for us to talk about tomorrow so people can sit with it. But are people feeling positive, neutral, negative? How about this? Let's see here. So we're going to do this the old-fashioned way, even though I can't ask people to put their heads down on their desk and raise their hand. We're going to try something virtually similar to this. And so I'm going to ask folks, if you're feeling generally positive about the enhancement of something similar to what Glenn said, I'm going to ask that you raise your hand in Zoom. And you raise your hand by hitting Alt-Y or hitting the reactions raise hand. And so the question is, are you feeling positive towards this? Okay, I see about 9 hands up now. Okay, so can I lower all the hands at once? Great. If you're feeling negative, I see a 10th hand there, negative or neutral about this language, I'm going to ask for folks to raise their hand. And Lorna, yes, I'm sorry, Clint, yes, the question is on Glenn's language there. So raise your hand if you're feeling negative or neutral. Okay. So we only had, so Kathleen, it was mostly positive. We had a couple of folks that perhaps had some reservations about it. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. We're going to,
Rob,
yeah.
I think actually, I think the comment in chat about Glenn's comment is on a state planning lead. I think that's actually, that would be a separate, that's a different proposal. It's an additional proposal.
Yeah, so thank you, Sue. So I was gonna move to that now. So Clint, I don't know if that changes how you feel about the
I'm fine with this
potential
language the way it is.
Okay, great. So Clint, do you have, not to put words in your mouth, but it sounded like you felt pretty strongly that there needed to be some kind of state lead role?
Well, that's what I think I'm hearing, and I don't know where it goes in on this, but it seems that what we're talking about is a transmission work group to support the state's initiatives. Well, while we can look at encouraging a regional, an RTO, and all these elements, but maybe it's best that the state leads that transmission planning and through this transmission facilitation program, and maybe even transmission construction. So if similar that we have a WSDOT state organization, I'm asking this question because it's what it kind of feels like is it should be is a state transmission group that plans and builds to achieve the state's objectives. I don't know if that fits into what we're talking about, but the door got opened with Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. That was new to me on the state's ability to participate with the transmission facilitation program.
Great, Clint, thank you for teeing that up. So I'm really interested to hear folks' reflections on what Clint said. And just for the record, I know we're running late, but this feels like it's such an important part of the culmination of our work that Kathleen, if you're okay, I'm gonna continue rolling with it for a little bit. Kathleen, you okay with that? Yeah, go ahead, Glenn, and then Stu.
I wanted to react a bit to this idea, kind of the question of
Mhm.
state role or state government role.
Mhm.
One thing that comes to mind for me is that there are examples in other states where the state actually created an entity that then at least finances and maybe even owns transmission facilities. New Mexico and Colorado come to my mind on that point. I think that it's very different, kind of how the transmission system is owned and managed compared to the highway system. And so the idea that we would somehow come up with something like the Washington State Department of Transportation, but for transmission, is like a really big step, and that smaller steps are more appropriate at this point. I also would note that in terms of financing and building transmission systems, we have existing entities like the Bonneville Power Administration and individual utilities. Joint operating agencies also have the authority to build transmission systems. The example of a joint operating agency is Energy Northwest, that owns and operates the Columbia Generating Station, our nuclear power plant, and some other smaller facilities as well. So, there are existing legal mechanisms for somebody that doesn't own transmission today to build and operate that. But to me, it seems like if we could do some coordination at the state level, kind of, identify solutions and try to get those adopted by people and address concerns that come up about it, that we could make a bigger difference faster than if we were to try to come up with some new institution within the state of who would actually go out and finance and build and operate transmission systems. So anyway, I do like the idea of calling for a stronger state role and coordination among the many different parties, and doing that on a state-to-state basis as well, even state to province with British Columbia and Alberta, but maybe not a new agency.
Great, Glenn, thank you. I've got Stu then Nicholas. Stu?
Yeah, just as a for point, I think Sarah laid out a model there of it, having a transmission planning lead for the state. So not so much that the state lead transmission planning, but that there be some, like a point person. And that I think what she described of what the governor did with the hydrogen work was great. So that might be a starting point, kind of just, ask the governor to do a thing like that, appoint someone which presumably, again, could be head of commerce, to figure that. And that, a year or 2 years, some years down the line, that could lead to a larger agency. But just to get everybody, just to get these things going, that's I think that building on what Glenn was saying, that's Sarah's proposed a great way to start with that, just to get someone whose job it is in the state to worry about this and make sure all the people are coming to a table whenever they need to, and that they're working together on this stuff, so we don't miss the boat.
Great, Stu, thank you. I've got Nicholas.
Yeah, I guess I want to double down on Glenn's comment. I think he's exactly right with regard to the state actually funding and building and operating transmission. I think that's pretty far outside the state's ability today. I mean, obviously that skill could be developed, but it would take a long time and would likely be very expensive to do so, and result in some challenges along the way. But what I think the state could really help is with not only planning, but also helping secure the permitting. Because right now, if you were to build any kind of significant transmission line, it could take 10 years just to go through the permitting process. And getting the state to do a plan saying, identify a corridor where a transmission line was needed and the size kind of settled in, and then help the consortium, and it's almost certainly going to be a consortium these days, to build a transmission line is the only way that I see new transmission being built in this state. It's just too difficult to go through the permitting process, too expensive. So, just a little expansion upon Glenn's recommendation.
Great, Nicholas, thank you. Okay, other reflections as folks make the decision on whether to jump into the conversation or not. Clearly, what's going to need to happen is we're going to need to do a little bit of work this afternoon, evening, to actually draft some of the language that we want to put out in front of you so we can talk about tomorrow. So my optimistic and clearly overambitious thinking that we could do this in real time. It's probably not going to happen, but that's totally okay. Any other thoughts on this? Particularly, it feels like the one place that we haven't yet talked about. We talked about the regional coordination. We talked about the state lead. We talked a little bit about the potential analysis and thinking around the RTO. We haven't talked much about any recommendation in here regarding funding opportunities that Sarah presented. Anything popping out in folks' mind about that we want to say about funding opportunities, or do we think that that's tied in to the state transmission planning responsibility?
This is Katie. I think that something that more directly stresses that it's a priority that we go after these funding opportunities may be appropriate, because it isn't just up to the states. There are planning entities, transmission owners who need to be applying for this funding. Some of the funding that I mentioned, the smart grid funding application is not open yet, but it really is on those transmission owners to go after that funding and lower the cost of some of the technologies that are typically not prioritized for one reason or another, and make them more economical. So some more direct language, I think, makes sense, rather than just assuming that kind of gets folded in at the state level.
Thank you, Katie. Other reflections on that?
Rob, this is Allison. I'm going to say what I always say, which is, when it comes to the review, state agencies and even federal agencies, we don't have the staff and we're not funded to do the project reviews. I say that over and over because I keep trying to hammer it home, but there is literally not enough humans either at the tribes or with actually some of the state agencies, including ours, and even some of the federal agencies, to do the work that we're expected to do. And it gets back to this idea that permitting is so difficult. Well, one of the reasons permitting is so difficult is because you don't have the staff to move things quickly, or dedicated staff to move things quickly. So something to think about. I know Congress and the legislature doesn't like to fund people because you can't really cut a ribbon in front of bureaucrats, but right, nobody's going to give you a reward for hiring more bureaucrats, but the reality is those are the people that do the work.
Thank you, Allison. Okay, other kind of reflections or final thoughts on this. I am very sensitive to the time constraints we have today, so I want to just recognize that this is an excellent start to the conversation. We're going to try to button it up tomorrow. Any other thoughts that folks want to share with one another about any amendments that we might make here to those specific principles, either about regional planning, regional coordination, state needs, funding? Yeah, Justin, please.
Hey, I apologize. I dropped off for a bit on accident. If we're just opening the discussion completely, I do have a suggestion, not related to 7 or 8 here, but WashDOT would like to see a little bit more on our agency's Dig Once policy, which is in development, directed by House Bill 1457, as well as the state broadband goals in the final report. I don't think I saw that in there. It was part of our presentation back in December, which it looks like the slide deck will end up being in Appendix 2, but quite a bit of progress has happened since then. And it's a pretty active issue. We're meeting this week with UTC, the Governor's Office in Commerce. I just think it would be maybe an enhancement to this report. I'm not sure if it goes in these emerging principles or not, but if that's something that you're open to maybe rolling up into the main part of the report, I could help get some language on that.
Okay, Justin, I'll tell you what. Are you going to be able to be here? Do you have to hop off between now and noon? Or are you going to be here?
I'll be here.
Okay, so right after our break, I'm going to ask you to maybe come in. We're gonna orient folks to what's in the report right now. Then we're going to take a break. And part of what we want to do is we want to put out on the table any those things that folks want to see, changes folks want to see to the report. I'll carve off 5 minutes for you to, and maybe you can begin organizing your thoughts about what specifically and where you'd like to see that in the report. And so we'll shoot to do that right after the break. Does that work?
Okay.
Sweet. Lorna.
Sorry, my hand was slow on the unmute button. I just want to echo what Allison said and maybe just state it from an IOU perspective on the government staffing, because I know probably everyone in government rolls their eyes because everyone in government needs more money and staffing, they probably think, but I just want to really support what she said from an IOU, like from a permit applicant perspective on the siting, and especially too with a legal background, uncertainty is a utility's biggest enemy, right? I mean, it's just uncertainty is what just paralyzes us. And when you don't have well-funded agencies that do robust reviews and the worst thing for us is an understaffed, overworked agency regulator that's trying to deal with our application, right? Because then you want a robust review that then is either not going to be appealed because it's such a good review, or if it is appealed, it's going to withstand appeal. Again, it's certainty. So more stuff up front on the certainty end. So I just want to bring it from a project applicant perspective. I think, it's like FSEC funding, right? For more FSEC staff. I think, again, overworked, underfunded staff creates a lot of uncertainty for applicants. So I just want to echo her point from a different perspective, if that makes sense.
Yep, it does. And so we can come back to that also after the break. I don't remember. I know that we've got very specific language in the report for the for DEA for Allison's the organization, the agency that Allison's recommending. But I have to refresh my memory about whether or not we've got a specific principle that gets at the broader point that you're making there, Lorna. And so we can come back to that after the break. So I know I've been teasing the break, but we're not there yet. So what I would like to do is I'd like to spend, Susan, maybe you could do this for us. I'd like to spend the next 5 to 7 minutes letting folks know where we're at with the report, how we got there, what's in there, and then tee up how we want to have the conversation following the break. Susan, could I turn it over to you to do that?
Yes, you can.
Yes, we can. Thank you, Susan.
All right, you bet. And I will keep this quick. So I'm not going to pull the report up and walk through it. Just want to give you a little bit of a recap of what happened between meeting 5 and meeting 6. So essentially what we did, and what you probably noticed, is there have been some formatting changes. Really the language for the principles, which we evolved from calling emerging principles to actual principles, I would bet that you will, in most cases, find those to be pretty darn close to what you saw and talked about. At least twice you have touched on these principles. We did do a little bit of modification with some task groups between meeting 5 and meeting 6. Actually, particularly around some of those RTO planning, transmission capacity, some of the conversation that we've had today, we actually did some work on that. That was in the report, but there's always room to improve that, and especially based on the conversations today. But that's what you will see. So format has changed. We've tried to organize some things. We've added some placeholders for some sections. We added the overburdened communities both as a finding, and then we put together a companion principle to go with that, and we worked with the task group there. Again, the language should be relatively familiar to you from the presentation that Mariel made to the group, and there was some really good group discussion on the second day of meeting 5. So that's something that we would want to note for you. We also created a table that is at the towards the end of the report, and it once those links are actually all active, it will enable people to go to each of the presentations, the recordings, as well as the slides. So excerpt it out. You won't have to look at the whole meeting recording in order to see what the presentation is. So we've tried to make that really easy for people to specifically look at content and find what this group was using as base information. So that, I think, is really the biggest changes. We tried not to add things in there, tried not to sneak anything in that would be a surprise to you. If the language is a little bit different, and especially if it's even a little bit more significantly different, it's because we were working with a group of members of this group to just try to improve the nuance and precision of that language. So we'll be very interested to hear what you have to say about that. So what we would like to do then after the break, and the reason that we provided this to you ahead of time, is we're hoping that you can, as you're going to the break, we'll have a 15-minute break, is that you can actually drop into the chat the specific section, if it's section D and it's item 6, or it's section E and it's item 4. If you can flag for us where you would like to discuss one of the principles or one of the findings, and if you would like to discuss that with the group, please let us know what that is. We're really asking you to point us towards what we need to talk about so that we don't literally just walk through the report. We don't really want to take the time to do that or take your time. Let's really focus on where you have things that need clarification or things that you need to discuss with the group because you're not sure that we've landed it in the right place yet. So that's what we're going to do after the break. Again, hope you had a chance to look at the report, that you can go through and identify and just drop them in the chat. Rob and Michaela and I will collect those from the chat. And then when you come back from break, we'll have a game plan for walking through. Any questions about what our plan is? So the draft was already provided to the work group members. So we can put it up on the screen. I'm just responding to a question from Don that's in the chat. We'll definitely have it up on screen to focus on those areas where there are questions, but we wouldn't have it on screen for people to literally read through the document. So if you're on the call and you don't have that document handy, please let us know and we can send that out to you. The draft has edits from today. It does. However, Don, I don't think we're going to jump into those. That's what we're going to be doing between today and tomorrow. So we really want to focus on the areas that we haven't talked about so far. Rob, please correct me if I'm getting that wrong.
Yep. Yeah, Don, the changes that you were seeing in real time are certainly not finished changes that we would want folks to give us a reaction to. And so what we're hoping, as Susan said, that folks similar to what Justin and Lorna did right before we switched gears, is just identify those places very specific places where they want to talk to one another about. And so what Justin and Lorna did is what we're asking folks to drop into the chat for us over the course of the next 15 minutes. So we're going to take a 15-minute break. We're going to come back at 11:10. And what we're going to do is we're basically going to work through our punch list. I guess this is like the contractor, your home contractor, walking you through the final changes. And so we want to identify what our punch list is, so we're able to talk to you about what changes you want to see made. So
Rob,
we're going to use the chat for the punch list. Yeah, Stu.
So Rob, what you're saying is the issues that we were talking about here today, based on today's comments, we're going to come back to those tomorrow and get some clean proposals.
Thank you, Stu.
What you want to spend the rest of the day here is talk about all the other stuff and see if we can approve all the other stuff.
What Stu said much better than I said. So the stuff that we've already talked about, we're going to come back with finished language tomorrow. What we want to spend the balance of the meeting talking about is the rest of the report that we have not yet had a chance to talk about, such as what Allison and Lorna brought up about potential funding, and what Justin brought up with regard to some of the specifics intersection points with the Department of Transportation. Thank you, Stu.
And Rob, just to note, I have Dawn and then another request for the document. So I will email that to the folks that have asked for it if you haven't had it. So if there's anyone else who is on the call and can't put their fingers on it.
Why don't we just float it to the top for everybody? Just send it up to our whole distribution list.
Sure. We can definitely do that. And there are some people I think that may not be on the distribution list necessarily. They should be, but we'll take care of that during the break.
Okay, sweet. All right, everyone, thoughts into the chat, and we will reconvene at 11:10. Thank you. 11:10. Okay, I ask that folks find their way back to their computers, your Zooms. Folks wouldn't mind either flipping on your video or giving me a thumbs up or something to let me know you're back. Hi, Will. Will, you did two things. Clint, everyone did. All right, you guys are awesome. Clint, Allison, thank you. Thank you for the Julie. Let's see who else put their thumbs up. Oh, I missed it. Julie got one. I got one from Lauren. Anders, welcome back, everybody. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to spend the balance of our time together. We got 3 or 4 specific places we want to jump into. The first is I'm going to give Justin the floor. Justin put a proposed edit into the chat. Susan's going to bring it up on the screen so we are all looking at the same piece of it. But Justin, I'm going to ask Justin to talk through and explain the recommended change. Second, over the break, trying to be responsive to the points that Allison and Lorna brought up. We highlighted the places in the document where we think that shows up with regard to staffing resources. And we want to ask the group if it is strong enough and sufficient enough. In the chat, Glenn suggested that we look at principles, a couple of principles in section E, which we're going to do. And then Clint made a specific language change on one of the pages. I just want to make sure folks are copacetic with that. So unless folks have other things that's on their mind, that's our punch list for today. And if other things that you want to talk about do come to mind, please put them in the chat and we will add them to the bottom of the punch list. Kathleen, is there anything else, any other thoughts as we move into this? Anything that, okay, great. And Anders, I see your topic there too, so we'll hit that. So Justin, why don't we start with yours? Susan has up there on the screen. Justin, jump in.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, so my recommended add here is basically just to incorporate some new direction that we have, some findings that came out of a end of year report from the Washington State Joint Transportation Committee that was driven by House Bill 1457. And that report basically had, it came up with a number of strategies for implementing broadband access to state highway right away. It also set us up for a dig once policy at WashDOT that we're still developing it, but it's, we're making progress on that, and it's going to affect also our utility accommodation policy as an agency. So I think it's important to ensure consistency with the recommended policies and strategies that came out of that December 2021 JTC report. And I can provide more detail if anybody's curious about that, but I think generally this captures it. I just kind of drafted this on the break.
Perfect. What do folks think? Folks generally comfortable with the recommended change? I guess what I'm really looking for is any significant heartburn that folks have over this. So I guess the floor is heartburn. If you have heartburn, I want to know about it. If you have anything more than heartburn, I also want to know about it, but heartburn is my threshold. And I really want to go more with that analogy, but my inner monologue is telling me, no, don't go any further with that.
I'm tempted to, Rob, but I won't.
Thank you, Susan. Okay, perfect. All right, next topic. Lorna.
Hey, Rob.
Yep.
Pardon me. I think that Glenn would like to take a look at the study maybe before jumping in with that.
Glenn, I'm sorry, I didn't catch that into the chat. Anything that you want to add?
Nope. Just want to see what it says about this use. I'm predisposed to be positive about it, but feel like I should actually look at it before I endorse it.
Thanks,
Perfect.
Justin. I was going to ask, maybe you can put the link in.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks. Thank you.
Okay, great. If folks take a look at that and it does generate post-meeting heartburn, let us know during the discussion tomorrow. Okay, so the next topic on the punch list was the point that Allison brought up and that Lorna +1. Susan, if you could go to the overarching principles section D. That is the place where the concept that we talked about most prominently shows up. And so Allison and Lorna, you'll see that we've got as part of an overarching principle that it's important to provide properly fund and it's state local agencies and it calls out DAHP and tribes.
We call out FSEC as the very first thing. I mean, that's really the humongous elephant.
Okay.
That would
Kathleen,
need to be funded first.
Kathleen, are you comfortable with that? Okay.
I figure you can't say it, Kathleen, but I can.
You know,
We've been through FSEC. It's like you need to have FSEC funded so you can get through FSEC.
You know, Rob, this is Allison. Federal agencies need to be staffed too, because you have, you know, U.S. Fish and Wildlife and other federal agencies that are understaffed along with state and local government. DFW. I know, like, it's true. None of us are staffed properly. I mean, you could say you could take out FSEC and DAP and just say properly fund tribes, federal, state, and local agencies to provide essential project reviews.
Well, I would just say, the only thing I would say is I would leave FSEC in there, Allison, only because FSEC is central to the core of trying to get, I mean, FSEC is like the director of the play.
Lorna, but I will say that the legislature also gave DAP a whole bunch of extra workload when it came to FSEC's responsibilities. So they gave actually DAP a whole bunch of responsibilities this session to assist FSEC. So we could leave FSEC, tribes, and DAP because the legislature did again give consultation. They increased consultation issues in the bill, in a bill. So yes, but I think you know, you write properly fund, but Rob, you're not saying who should properly fund. And I think it's both Congress and state government, because some of the work sometimes hits the federal level too. I mean, properly fund, unfortunately, is just so generic. Everybody says, yeah, sure, we should properly fund, and then nobody ever does it.
Well, I think a lot of these are principles, Allison, we're like striving towards. And again, sorry, I don't mean to exclude tribes or DAP. I just was trying to recognize who has to be like the main siting agency, but we could just say properly fund relevant agencies.
I'm just trying to say that FSAC without the funding in the other agencies doesn't get you anywhere. You're still going to be stuck and you're still going to be frustrated.
Yeah, I mean,
because FSAC can't do their work. I mean, the way this new bill passed this session without DAP and the tribes, FSAC won't be able to make a decision.
Yeah, I know. It goes both ways, right? Like if FSAC isn't funded, it doesn't matter if everyone else is funded.
That's right. Yeah, everybody has to be funded or it's just useless, the whole thing. And that includes DFW. But I just think, Rob, being in government for unfortunately decades, when you have a statement that's so generic as properly fund, people just gloss over it.
So are
because
folks
you're not saying who should
are folks comfortable with Allison's suggestion that we add U.S. Congress and Washington State Legislature? What's popping out in my mind is that the structure of that first sentence, and I told myself I wasn't going to get trapped into wordsmithing, but I'm letting myself get trapped into wordsmithing, is some structure that says who should properly fund those agencies providing essential project review, e.g., or some structure like that.
You can do it that way. I'm just saying that leaving it at properly fund becomes meaningless unless you state somewhere who's responsible for who's responsible for properly funding.
Okay, got it.
And I don't care how you do it. That's fine. Your EG is fine.
Okay, great.
And not to further devolve, Rob, but just wondering if we should have this just between our sections, if this should be in section F, because this is what you need for expedited review, right? You need, without compromising protections, you need good staff, right?
Humans.
Yeah.
Human
Yeah.
beings.
So that's what I'm just thinking. Like, I mean, just, you need bodies that can actually get to the work, have enough time to do the work thoughtfully, right?
Okay, got it.
So Brendan said there could be fees. Actually, that doesn't work. I know there was on another project, not transmission, the project developer offered to fund staff for a tribe, and the tribe said no, because they didn't trust they felt conflicted by taking money from the developer. And I don't think our agency is allowed to take fees either. We have to be.
But FSEC and other places can. So I mean, the answer might be different for different entities.
It is. So you can put that in there, but you need to qualify that it's not a all-encompassing way to do business. I can't take fees.
It is true that some can be done with fees, but it's not the central piece, I have to say, because the fees only come after the project, even for FSEC, has applied to us, right? So all of the work that goes into planning or pre-application or any of that early on conversation does not come through fees. So I think if we're really talking about being effective and efficient, we have got to put the focus of having enough bodies, and the fees may not pay for a whole body. And, if you just have someone's arm, it doesn't help you. So you need their brain. Maybe their arm and their brain would be a good match. But so I do think the focus needs to be on that. I mean, not baseline funding, the funding for the effort that has to take place.
So, yeah, Brendan, please.
I bring this up because our agency is funded in a number of different ways, and largely the kind of stuff I do is not associated with fees. And every time we try to get money, somebody in OFM comes back and says, well, can't we charge a fee for that? And in the end, so we have a lot of work that's unfunded, and most of that on the big project reviews are covered through applicant cost reimbursement. So you're kind of touching on three different funding mechanisms, and depending on which agency and what process, you may have a mix of these. But the fee question will come up if you go to the state legislature and ask for funding.
Okay. Any final thoughts on this one? And so I think I understand what changes we have to make. And then Lorna, to your suggestion, and we have a principle in section F10 that we will make sure carries a parallel construction in terms of concepts. I mean, just and make that very explicit, that as part of the expediting section that we talk about resource. Okay, Susan, I want to go to, and Glenn, I'm going to come to you right now. I'm going to ask you to talk about E4 and E5. So section E is the system planning one. And so Glenn, what was it that you wanted to tee up here?
Thanks. The first thought I had about 4 and 5 was that they're sort of saying the same thing, and that we could probably consolidate that. But then as I thought about it some more, I also want to suggest that we look at creating a principle in the overarching section in D that would cover these 2 points. And what I see here in 4 and 5 is the idea that Washington's, you know, at the broadest level, our policy objectives can be achieved most successfully if the West, you know, the United States West has a robust, reliable electric power transmission system that allows us, you know, everybody to draw on resources that can be situated, you know, where they operate most effectively, and that we share resources across the West. And, you know, when one area has especially high need, they can draw on other areas. And that's a principle that's reflected in the state energy strategy. You know, we've seen it recently at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in their notice of proposed rulemaking. And so I think it's something that we could call out as really serving as the, you know, one of the fundamentals for why we're even looking at transmission corridors at all. It's because on several different dimensions, our state's going to be better off if it's part of a bigger, more robust transmission system across the West.
Great. Thank you, Glenn. And are you thinking that that overarching principle replaces 4 and 5, or we still want to keep the granularity here of 4 and 5 in this section?
No, I feel like that it could be you know, removed from the planning part, because a lot of the other I mean, because it's really I think more about the vision for what the nature of the transmission system would look like. And then in the planning section, we could talk about how we go about achieving that, you know, through organizations, the you know, efficient use of whatever system we do have, things like that. So, you know, if we wanted there to be a principle in this section to support that, I wouldn't oppose it, but I feel like it could be expressed entirely in the overarching section.
Okay, great. Thank you, Glenn. What do folks think about that? So Glenn's suggestion here is that it is not, we're not removing the concept, but we're broadening the concept because this concept of the integrated transmission system and the diversification applies more broadly than just the system planning section. So not removing the concept, but elevating it and broadening it just a little bit.
That makes sense.
Okay, thank you. Any heartburn? Again, the heartburn's the floor. Okay, so Glenn, you must know that this request was coming. If you have 10 minutes after this meeting, if you wouldn't mind maybe putting a couple of sentences together that we could work from to move up to, I'd deeply appreciate that.
No, I can do that. And that way people can look at it tomorrow.
Great, thank you, Glenn. And I don't want that to serve as a disincentive for speaking up because I already have my punch list. Okay, let's move to E6. Glenn?
Yeah, and that's me too. So on this one, I know we've got that where feasible qualifier in there, but I'm really struck by the fact that we go to meetings about siting generating facilities, and we talk about you know, the impact that those have on communities, on cultural and natural resources. And then we go to meetings on the transmission system. And, you know, at some point they all have a similar, though not the same exactly, set of costs and benefits. And this one to me seems a little bit like we're pushing the problem over to some other committee. And so I do see in here a good idea about that, if you have local generation that is, like solar that's on the top of warehouses or in, the side of a decommissioned coal mine, that there could be low impact local generation that should be preferred over transmission build out. But that my sense is that we run out of those pretty quick, and we end up then with a trade-off between building larger renewable generating facilities that have as many adverse impacts as transmission would. So anyway, I don't have a specific suggestion on how to reword this, but I did want to express some concern about how when I read it fresh yesterday, it seemed a little, I don't know, like we were pushing the problem off on somebody else.
Okay, great, Glenn, thank you for that. Lorna.
Yeah, I echo what Glenn said, but I guess, I don't know, from a simple standpoint, we are required to do least cost, right? So if it's least cost to site generation near load where feasible, I think that's already kind of baked into the system. I think just to Glenn's point, I just worry having this in here kind of creates a different, like, regardless of least costs, you're going to try to do that. And Glenn's right, that just pushes off, anybody who doesn't want the transmission line is, it goes against the whole nature of why building out transmission is this public policy dilemma. It's like a tragedy of the commons, So, but I just was saying site new generation near load or feasible, it's confusing to me because that means without regard to cost, so I think we need to be careful from a public policy standpoint. If we're saying without regard to cost, we're going to do that. Because he's right. This is going to elicit all sorts of stuff. I mean, downtown Bellevue needs its own power plant because that's who needs the load, right?
Clint?
Thanks. I'm one of the entities that probably did advocate for this. I do think it's important to recognize that the transmission does affect communities, particularly if it's an east to west, negatively. It negatively affects the communities that transmission goes through when it's serving load to the west side. And so the right way to do this on any planning is to site the generation where it should be utilized. You can wordsmith it. You could put in feasible. You could put in least costs. I just think it does a disservice to the communities if we don't recognize that generation should be sited near the load. And
I'm not saying, Clint. I'm not saying, Clint, that you don't always look at doing that if it's least cost. I'm just saying, for example, if you think of all the natural resources, necessary to build out a wind farm, right? And then just think of all the precious earth minerals you use. Why would you build a wind farm on the west side with this ridiculously low capacity to put it near, this is the public policy conundrum of energy, right? So should you spend a whole bunch more money on super fancy, expensive wind plants on the west side that aren't going to have as much capacity because that's where the load is? It just gets to the crux of it. So I'm not saying, Clint, that we don't already consider this and try to do this. I'm just saying there's a real cost impediment at some point, and this just creates a confusing standard of, are we proposing a brand new standard? So regardless of least cost, you need to do it this way? Because if we want renewables, we need to accept that they're stronger, you know, it's very different building renewables in different parts of the state.
I think we're too tunnel visioned in on renewables, that the focus is on clean, and it doesn't just have to be renewable. And so it may be very hard for people to comprehend or to embrace, but there are other resources besides, there are other resources that are clean other than renewables.
No, I hear you. I guess I'm just saying this would mean right now, I mean, just as a utility, like this means we're citing natural gas plants, right? Places like they're just fossil. This is why we have fossil in our system, because of this partially, right? So, I mean, small scale nuclear is like not ready yet. I mean, so I hear you. I agree with you on it should be just carbon, not carbon emitting. I'm just telling you this creates a real kind of, are you creating a new standard about least cost doesn't matter anymore?
Okay, I'm going to stay with that. I object if it gets removed. This is a fundamental statement, and I'm going to stay with that. Of course, if it's a community voted on, but that's just where I think it's important that we do recognize that it should be done efficiently.
And maybe we can just caveat it, Clint. I'm just trying to ask if you were proposing something beyond what we already do, and to pay more and a premium to build like smaller, less efficient plants on the west side, right? Because that's just a different way of doing things.
No, what I'm saying is that we recognize that the generation should be sited where the load is, and that we've considered that as a foundation for transmission planning.
Well, based on what Clint has said, and I see the logic behind it, so I'm comfortable keeping this, and maybe it could be, we could introduce the idea of cost effectiveness also being considered, but I no longer object to having it included here.
Yeah, wordsmith it however you want. It just should be, some element of it should be there.
Yeah.
Okay. So Glenn, Clint, and well, I'll tell you what. So we will take a run at trying to trying to finesse the language a little bit that doesn't imply, Lorna, that it's a new standard, but Glenn recognizes the importance of keeping it in because of just recognizing that the impact to local communities. I do want to say very, very quickly, I'm not going to jump into this right now because I want to use the remaining time we have today. We have a proposal for how to handle if we reach mini loggerheads. If we're at major loggerheads, it's not going to be in the report. This feels to me like it's a mini loggerhead that we're coming to. And we know that there are not enough TCWG meetings we could schedule to make this like 100% wordsmith happy. So we know we've got an idea on how to deal with that we're going to talk to you all tomorrow about, because we have to make final decisions about what goes in here pretty soon. So we'll take another run at it, and we can take a look at the language tomorrow and get a final feedback on it. So before I move on, Glenn, Clint, Lorna, or others, any final thoughts on this one?
I know Katie in the chat, had a comment about it too.
Katie, any thoughts you want to verbalize?
I think everything's been verbalized in some way. I agree that the resources that are viable at this point and economical do require that we cite where geographically appropriate. So I don't think that this principle fits with CETA's goals or the state's other energy goals. But again, if we can wordsmith it differently, I'd be willing to look at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Katie. Okay, let's see here. Clint, while I have you off of mute, you had a pretty straightforward suggestion on page 17, Appendix 2, that we just need to be a little bit more consistent with the use of the term zero emission source to non-emitting, which is what we established on page 14. So that feels like it's pretty straightforward to me. Anything else you want to add on that one?
No, and I apologize, get into the wordsmithing on it. Sorry about that.
Oh, the gravitational pull, Clint. We all feel it. Okay, cool. Next on the list here is B1. Susan, I'm gonna flip up to that. And Anders, I'm gonna ask that you come off of mute and share what you're thinking about for B1.
Hope nobody gets busy.
First.
So what am I going to now? I'm sorry. B.
Anders, where did you want us to go?
Oh, okay. On page 8.
Oh, page 8. Okay.
Geographic needs and considerations. This is B1.
B1, there it is. Yeah.
Yeah, on that second bullet about north to south for along the I-5 corridor, I just wanted to clarify that those upgrades would likely be needed not just for the reason in the parentheses there about bringing in abundant solar from California and hydro from Canada, but also for the parenthetical in the first bullet. In order to get the wind and solar from east of the Cascades to the end users and the load centers, in addition to the Cascades upgrades, there's multiple bottlenecks in the I-5 corridor that have been identified in recent studies and that would likely need to be addressed.
Great.
You could just say for the above plus bringing in abundant solar,
Yeah, right. Yeah, that sounds good.
Great. Yeah, Katie.
So while we're on this section, I did have a thought on the third bullet, which is to do with offshore. So offshore is something that hasn't been stood up here in Washington yet. There is a long lead time with this technology. There's a lot that needs to be done in order to realize offshore build out here in Washington. And given those long lead times, I don't think that this second half of the sentence, if projected offshore wind development occurs, makes sense, because we wouldn't want to build those projects and then start thinking about transmission to bring it to load, especially given that offshore does show up in the Washington State Energy Strategy as coming online around 2040 or so. So just wanted to call out that maybe we strike the last bit of that sentence.
So before you do that, Susan, so just to make it maybe consistent with the structure above, it feels to me as if we have to get rid of potentially in, and so it would be something like Grays Harbor to I-5 corridor, and then in parens, see, Clint, it's like the gravitational pull is so high to do this. Then in parens, it would be 2040 projected offshore wind in CETA or something like that, bringing in, okay, perfect.
Yeah, given projected offshore wind development, something like that.
Perfect. Okay, so we got through our punch list. We have about 12 minutes left. Are there other places that folks want to jump into in this report here?
Rob, can I just reflect that we had just a minor suggestion that came from, I believe it was Ben and then Don, and it had to do with, I'm trying to find it again. It was just it had to do with the funding. So there was just a suggestion in the chat that would be very easy to make.
Yes, and so it had to do with the nuance, Brendan, that you introduced about potential fees And Ben from DFW suggested some nuanced language in there that I think that we could pull into what we show you tomorrow. And so folks want to see that, it's in chat. I've also lost it in the string of chat there.
Properly fund or provide authorization to receive funding, something like that.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm not seeing anything else in the chat. So I'm gonna give folks the opportunity to verbalize any other places they want to go with this today. Okay, so Kathleen, what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk about tomorrow just a little bit here, so we can set expectations. So it's crunch time, right? We've got 3 hours left together, and to make best use of those 3 hours together, it's going to require us to do a little bit of work, some of us more than others, between now and tomorrow. So what Susan, Michaela, and I will do is we will take the feedback we got from today, and we will try to make the recommended changes that we talked about having to do with system planning, some of the changes that we had talked about today, and we will, and I don't know the exact mechanism by which we're going to do it, but we're going to get that language out to you sometime, hopefully by the end of the day today. If you could carve out 30 minutes tomorrow before the meeting sometime to take a look at that language that we're proposing, because we're going to try to make the final, get final input to the changes that we talked about. Our assumption, so we're clear going forward, is that the places that we have talked about and identified are the places where we've got work left to do. And so that means that the places that were not identified are places that folks feel sufficiently comfortable with. What we're going to open the day with tomorrow is we're going to be talking to you about kind of the process post the meeting tomorrow to get the document complete. And so we are not going to be entering into endless do loops, but we're also not going to be asking you to sign on to something that you don't have some agency over. And so we're trying to strike that balance between endless do loops and maintaining your agency, and the charge that this group has, that Kathleen, as the chair of this group, is the one that's transmitting it to the legislature. So we'll talk about that process. We'll talk about final changes. And then what I'm asking folks to do to get us prepared for the conversation part about tomorrow is that once this report is done and it's transmitted to the legislature, then the work begins. What we've done up to this point hasn't been the work. The work really begins once that report is done. And especially in light of the awesome conversations that we had leading up to it, and especially today, I want to have a conversation with you all about how you tap that energy and that momentum going forward. And so that's what the latter half of the day is tomorrow. So Kathleen, that's all I got for today. And so I want to turn it over to you for to share any final thoughts and then close us out.
Just want to again thank everybody for participation, for honest conversation, and taking on these critical issues and working in such a collaborative spirit, even when we have some disagreements. I appreciate the conversation today. So thank you and see you tomorrow.
Great. Thanks, everybody. And we will get started at 9 o'clock tomorrow, and public comment is at 10:40. So we will talk to everyone tomorrow. Take it easy.
Thanks.